All right, I just got the thumbs up that we're going live. So, hi everybody, my name's Dr. Lindsay. I'm the medical director and a staff veterinarian for the Animal Care Center in Utah Dog Park. Welcome to the We Care series. So, this is our client education series, and what we like to do each month is invite a speaker from different areas, whether it be behavior or medical issues or even some fun topics on, how to be active with your pets and things like that. So this month I'm very excited. We have our very own Shane Tyler. So Shane is one of our senior managers for the Utah Dog Park, and he's also our lead staff trainer as well in canine behavior for our Utah Dog Park and Animal Care Center teams. He is going to talk to us about how to master the leash walk. And I know that who has a hard time with their pets on leash? I know sometimes my guy he doesn't want to listen to me. So I'm hoping that we all get some really, really good pointers from Shane, and he's going to educate us on some nice topics today. So I'm going to hand it over to Shane.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you don't need this.
I don't need that.
Oh, and if you have any questions just raise your hand, and I'll come over with my speaker, and I will have those questions answered.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lindsay. Like you said, my name is Shane Tyler. I've been training for about 11 years now, studying for even longer. I've been involved with rescues, vet clinics, boarding facilities, shelters, a wide variety. And when it comes to behavior issues, one of the most common complaints that I get asked about, or I would say probably about like 90 to 95% of people that when they contact me and they give their whole list of the issues that they're facing, something about the walk is on one of them. So it's a really, really common problem that a lot of people have. And the tricky thing that a lot of people tend to run into is that there's so many different pieces of advice and training techniques and training styles. And there's a saying in the training world that the only thing two trainers can agree on is that the third one's wrong, which unfortunately is very true. There's a lot of just various opinions. And so when it comes to teaching and training and working on behavior issues, I really try to focus more on teaching the dog self-control, getting them to willingly want to do what you ask instead of using techniques that are more forceful or more of a like do what I say or else kind of mentality. And so when you're looking at the walk and leash things, there's a few different things that we're going to go over that will help understand why you may be having problems out on the walk. So the first one that we're going to be looking at is, I oftentimes use the analogy that learning to walk on a leash and just those walk skills it's a lot like trying to teach someone how to swim. The big common problem that people run into is that their usual go-to is just chucking them in the deep end. They're immediately trying to take the dog for a walk. They're trying to get the dog to listen, a lot of pulling on the leash, getting after the dog, trying to drag them to your side. And that's like chucking someone in the deep end and then getting upset with them and really frustrated because they don't know what to do. You haven't really taught them what it is that you need to do. You always want to look at, again, using that analogy, you start in the safety of the shallows. The shallow end of the pool, you learn the basics. As you get those basics down, you start to build up and make those basics a bit more difficult, and you gradually go into deeper water as you go. But a lot of times, you have to really go at the dog's pace. You can't force them. So a common question that I get from people is, my dogs do much better off leash. They're more friendly, they seem more relaxed, they're more engaging with other people or other dogs, but as soon as I put them on leash, they become really defensive, or they get really aggressive, or really nervous, or they just won't listen to me at all. And there's a big reason for that. Starting with, when dogs are in an uncomfortable situation, they have 3 defense mechanisms: flight, freeze, and fight. Anytime that there's a dangerous situation, they're going to take those defense mechanisms in that order because it goes to their survival instinct. Your best chance of survival is to avoid potential danger and threats. And so that's why their first go-to is going to be flight. For the exact same reason, that's why the last option is going to be fight, because it holds the most risk and the most danger. You may not come out on top if you go charging in head first into a fight. Freeze can be anything in between that, trying to run away and avoid versus engaging or trying to defend themselves or fight back. Freeze oftentimes are going to be what are called calming signals. The most common calming signals that you may see are going to be things like avoiding eye contact, licking their lips, yawning. It could be lifting a paw and maybe shifting their weight back and forth. Curving, where rather than going straight towards, you kind of curve around because that's safer. There's a wide variety of different calming signals, and we won't go too much into detail on those just because we could be on that topic all night. We have talked about it in a previous seminar that we did on the understanding body language, so you can always go back to that one on the Animal Care Center's Facebook page and find that video. But frequently, the freeze for dogs tend to be those calming signals. They can't run away, so their best chance at that point is to try to diffuse that situation and try to avoid the conflict without being able to actually physically move away from it. Sometimes, though, freeze can be an attempt to intimidate or bluff their way out of a situation. This is going to be when dogs are showing their teeth, they're growling, barking, their hackles go up. Very similar behaviors that look like fight for dogs, but the big difference is that they're still doing these things at a distance. They're still trying to keep their distance. It's more of that warning of, hey, back off, leave me alone. This is what you're going to be dealing with if you keep pushing it. And so it's almost like they're trying to bluff their way out of the conflict and scaring away whatever that problem is before it becomes more of a serious threat or where they have to defend themselves. So when you look at dogs on leash versus off leash, they've got flight, freeze, and fight all available to them. As soon as you put them on leash, though, you've taken away their safest defense mechanism, which is to avoid. And so a lot of times dogs will automatically go to freeze, but oftentimes, okay, well, freeze isn't working because you're still coming at me. Or you sometimes will get the dogs that overcompensate and almost develop more of the attitude of, I'm going to get you before you can get me, and they kind of develop that mindset of best defense is a good offense, where it seems like they just jump straight to fight or to defend themselves. And so this is why statistically, you're much more likely to be bitten by a dog that's on leash or that's tied up than one that's loose, because they're more threatened. They can't run away. They don't have their safest option to resort to. So this is going to be a big reason why a lot of dogs tend to overreact or be leash aggressive versus when they're off leash and they seem to do just fine. The other thing, though, to keep in mind, because what I usually will do and encourage my clients to do is actually hold off on taking the dogs for a walk. And you want to start to teach them these different skills that we'll talk about in just a second, off leash in the home. Now, dogs do still need adequate exercise. They still need that mental stimulation. But there's a lot of different ways that you can do that don't involve taking the dog for a walk. If you have a fenced backyard, playing with them in the backyard. It could even be you walking just in circles in the backyard so that they're still getting that physical exercise in. If you don't have a fenced backyard, taking your dog to daycare, taking your dog to a friend's yard and letting them run around and play there. Supplementing some of that physical exercise for mental stimulation. Things like puzzle toys. Training can be mental stimulation for them. Treat searches, where you take a handful of food, you toss it in the grass, and they have to go sniff and find it. And because they have to focus so much on trying to find where each piece went, it tends to wear them out just as much as a lot of the physical stuff can. And so you do still need to have adequate exercise and that mental stimulation, but you don't have to take your dog for a walk to get it. There's plenty of other options to be able to supplement that. Now, we'll talk about the different types of equipment that are commonly out there that people use, and we'll talk about pros and cons of each of them. Now, these are going to be just some of the most common tools that are out there. There's so many different gadgets and things that people will do and use, and the companies will claim that it's going to solve, issues on the walk. But like I said, each one has a different pro and a different con. So the first one is just a regular collar and leash. Now for this, some of the pros for it is going to be that most dogs have a collar and leash. It's the most common thing out there. as long as it's wider and soft enough, it's not going to cause too much pain for the dog. But some of the cons to it is that they still can pull and it can choke them. Studies are starting to come out suggesting that it can actually cause physical and medical problems because of all the nerves, all the glands that tend to be in the throat, windpipe, cutting off their air can affect their brain, things like that. So it does still, unfortunately, make it easy for them to pull and to choke themselves. The Halti and the Gentle Leader. Now this one, the pros for this, because it goes around the face and the muzzle, is that it's really easy for a lot of people to be able to control their dogs a little bit more, especially if they tend to be more reactive on leash. It's easier to draw them away from it, because if they start pulling, it naturally turns their head, and it's, for a lot of people, easier for them to move the dog away. And it can make a lot of people feel more comfortable and more confident because they feel like they have more control over the situation. Some of the problems with the Haltis, though, is that a lot of dogs get irritated by it. They spend a lot of time just pawing at it. It can also, again, it's not a guarantee that it's going to stop them from pulling. So if a dog is still insisting on pulling, it can actually throw out their neck and cause issues there. One of the big problems that I tend to have with it is that I feel like it's good and it's healthy for the dog to be able to look around and be aware of their surroundings. Because I look at it the same way that if it were me, and say I'm walking down the street late at night and I can hear someone walking behind me, but someone's in front of me holding my head forward and I can't look back to see what that noise is, it's gonna stress you out more and more, and it's gonna put you more and more on edge. I feel like it's good for them to be able to have that ability to be aware of what's in their environment and their surroundings, because it can potentially help to diffuse some of those situations. However, we'll talk about this a little bit later, because how to get them to pay attention so that you can still lead them away so they're not immediately jumping to overreacting. The next one we'll talk about is going to be the retractable leash. This is probably one of the few times where a majority of trainers are going to agree on something. Retractable leash for me, well, we'll talk about the pros. The pros for this is that it gives the dog more length, more freedom to be able to move. You can shorten it up if you need to really easily, or if you're in an open area, you can let them have more freedom. But the problem with the retractable leash, they can break really easily, and then you're kind of stuck. I've had it personally cause injuries, rope burns, whether it's on the hand or a dog that's running and then they run around someone's leg and it just burns right through that person's leg and causes really deep cuts and burns from it. The other big problem with this, unless it is locked into place, your goal is to teach the dog to walk on a loose leash and that there should be no tension in the leash. But unless that's locked into place, there's always going to be some degree of tension there. And so it gets really hard to teach them to not have it on, not to have tension in the leash when you're using the retractable. So for me personally, and I know a lot of other trainers that agree with this, I don't personally recommend the retractable leashes. When you're working on distance control and things like that, I'll go and get what's called a long leash or a long line, which it looks just like a normal leash that's 30 or 40 feet long. And then I'll just coil it up so it's however much length I want it to have. But that way it's not gonna break as easily. If it gets pulled out of your hand, now you don't have something that's chasing after your dog, making all sorts of noise and hitting into things and hitting into people or other dogs or things like that. So the next one that we'll talk about is gonna be the harness. Now the pros on the harness is that it removes the pressure from the neck. It makes them be able to, provided that you use a good harness like the one here where it goes around the neck, comes down the front and the back, and then it clips around the waist. That leaves full range of motion for the legs. It's probably the most comfortable equipment for a dog. However, the downside to the harness is what do we put on huskies to pull sleds, or on working dogs that pull carts or things like that. We put them on a harness because it lets them really dig in and really pull. So ideally, this is my preferred tool to use. But again, you can't just give the harness and expect that this is going to stop them from pulling, because potentially it can just make them pull easier. You have to teach them otherwise to not pull and how to listen to you. The next one that we'll talk about is going to be slip leads. Now, slip leads, I personally feel like everybody should have at least 1 or 2 slip leads, because the pros on it is that you don't need the collar. It's in case of an emergency, you can just quickly slip it over the head, and you're good to go. So I'll be kind of clip onto the collar, or if the collar breaks, then you're out of luck. I always have a few of these in my car, because when there's a stray dog that's running loose in the street or something like that, it's really easy to use that instead of right on it and try to hold the spot and protect them. Biggest downside though of the slip lead is that not only can it choke them, but it can keep getting in. And there's a lot of times there's nothing to stop it from tightening. So potentially you could be doing a lot of distress to that throat for those dogs. So I keep those slip leads for those emergency situations, but in terms of just like your regular walking, I probably wouldn't recommend it as much. Now the last one is going to be prong collars and pinch collars. The pros for this is that for a lot of really difficult dogs, it can stop a lot of the pulling pretty quickly and pretty easily. The downsides to this, and this is a hot topic and a hot debate in the training world, because a lot of trainers are very much against it and a lot of trainers are very much for it and say that all the criticism is over exaggerated. I've had some trainers say that this is the most humane collar that you can use for a dog because it distributes the pressure more evenly. But the problem is that, plain and simple, the pinch collars and the prong collars work off the mentality of if you pull, it's going to dig in, and minimally it's going to be uncomfortable, if not hurt. I've had multiple people try to say, well, no, it just uses pressure. It doesn't use pain. Well, if it was just using pressure, a normal collar does that. A slip lead does that. The whole concept is that it digs in and it gets uncomfortable. Plus, there's a whole lot of pressure points around the neck that it can be digging into. Especially when it's used incorrectly. I've seen many situations where it starts digging in, and especially with dogs that are more stubborn that just continue to pull, it can actually start puncturing the skin and causing some serious injuries and some serious damage. So for me personally, I do not recommend the prong collars or the pinch collars, because it can cause injuries really easily, and I don't like using the mentality of do what I say or else with the dogs. I feel like there's a lot better ways to be able to work with your dogs. So does anyone have any questions with equipment or anything like that? Yes.
Oh, I'm coming. I'm coming
hold
for
on
the Facebook Live. Sorry.
Okay.
There you go. Facebook Live.
Oh, face the class.
Hello, class.
I was wondering about the shock collars, because there's ones that vibrate, there's ones that give a mild shock, there's
Yeah.
ones that give a bigger shock, and I didn't see those on here.
Yeah, and so when it comes to the shock collars, a lot of times that's also used more for like long distance stuff. I personally don't use those. The only time that I personally would use one of those if it was just vibrating and for use with like a deaf dog that you needed to be able to get their attention from more of a distance. That's another, just like the prong collar, that's a very hot topic debate in the training world. Some are adamant against it, some aren't and are very supportive of it, saying, oh, well, it's just very mild, it's more of a stimulus than really a shock. The tricky thing is, oftentimes people will go and test it like on their arm or their hand. Well, the skin on your arm is a lot different than in the neck, and specifically with dogs, because dogs are way more sensitive than we are. This is why a lot of times dogs are going to maybe react to very slight stimulus that we can't even detect. But it's because they're much more sensitive to those type of things. Me personally, very, very early on, long time ago, and it was more like out of a desperation thing. I wasn't as experienced. I had just barely started trying to learn different training techniques. With the family dog, we used a shock collar. And even though it claimed it was waterproof, I had one time where it got water on it and it shorted out and started shocking him on high voltage. And so he started screaming and thrashing on the ground. And so that for me was, nope, there's got to be a better way. So that's another one where I personally don't use it, unless the only exception for me is if it's like a vibrating function, and more of like a deaf dog or one that has a very hard time hearing. So yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I put it on my neck and put it on low, and I put it on high, and I go, I'm not putting this on anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
So,
done.
any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
So for a dog that's more just excited to see anything that's living and moving,
Yes.
would you recommend maybe like doing like different types of equipment, like maybe start with something and then with a different one, or
So
just
what I would recommend with stuff like that is, again, you start first at home because there's fewer distractions. You know, you're letting the dog, initially I practice the skills that we'll talk about off leash to do like that groundwork, kind of going back to that whole swimming mentality of starting in the shallows with the basics. And you start off leash because it gives them all three options of flight, freeze, and fight. Practicing in the home, there's less distractions. It's more of that controlled environment because if they're not listening, where are they going to go? And then you gradually build up from there. So when they're doing well in the house, you start to practice in the backyard where, provided that it's fenced, it's just an extension of the home. But now there's more distractions. And then I start working on leash in the house because now you've taken away the flight option and there's that new expectation of no tension on the leash. And then when they're doing well in the house on leash, then it's on leash in the backyard, and then in the front yard, and then across the street and back, down a few houses back, and you gradually build up how far away you can walk them. But it's those slow little doses that help build them up, so that way when they start to come across different things, you've taken some of those behaviors that you're teaching them and turned them into habits. And it'll make more sense when we start talking about the pay attention requests that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So. Okay.
Shane, I just had a quick one. For when
Yeah.
you're just starting out, how long of a leash should you get? Because you go to the pet stores and there's the little tiny one that's really short, and then there's the super long ones. What's a good starting length?
So for me personally, a lot of it really boils down to how comfortable do you feel with the length of leash. Me personally, I prefer the 4-foot ones just because it feels like I'm not tripping on it constantly. The dogs aren't stepping over it and having to untangle it all the time. Other people prefer the 6-foot ones to give a little bit more freedom. You can always shorten that up. Some people will go for like a 10-foot one or by hooking a couple of them together. So, you know, there's not necessarily like a specific size that's better than the other in the beginning. It's mostly just what do you feel most comfortable with is what I would say. So, okay, so let's talk about rewards for dogs. Now, rewards, when you're trying to teach something new to a dog, there's 3 common forms of it. There's praise and attention, toys and playtime, and then food. Now, food can be broken down even further. Food can be seen as a treat, a bribe, or a reward. A treat for me is basically kind of like a no strings attached. So you're not asking them to come. You're not asking them to sit. You know, it might be that you're making dinner, there's a couple extra scraps, and you just kind of toss it to them. Or it could be those treat searches where you're just going in the backyard and you're just tossing those treats in the grass and letting them go find them. You know, you're not necessarily making them do something for it. A bribe is when you're using the food to lure them to go do something. And so it could be like trying to get them to go in a kennel, and so you toss in the food in the kennel, and they're just going in after the food, and then you shut it. It's not really teaching them to go in the kennel willingly and then they get rewarded for it, like how a food reward would be. It's just them chasing after the food and you're getting the short results. The problem that you're going to run into, though, if you're just using bribes, is that you're going to quickly become dependent upon always having to have food, which is not realistic. And so when you're looking at what type of food rewards to be using, ideally, you're going to want something that is small and soft. And you can get these just really at any pet store, but something that size is really all you should need. A lot of people say, well, my dog's not really motivated by food. Guaranteed you can find something. You just have to find the right thing. Keep in mind that it's not always dog treats. It might be a hot dog cut up into small pieces, string cheese. A lot of dogs, that's like crack for them. But the reason why you want something small and soft is because if you give them more of a bigger like milk bone biscuit or something like that as a reward, well, now they're sitting there chewing it up and pieces are falling, so they got to, okay, where did that piece go? And now they're just focusing more on the food as opposed to you give them that food reward and they're pretty much instantly swallowing it. Okay, wait, great, that's awesome, what's next? And so that's when you're looking at rewards for trying to teach them something, something that's small and soft is ideally what you're going to want to go for. When you're talking about rewarding a dog for doing something right, they need to come pretty immediately. You can't go and ask the dog to come and they come over and then, okay, wait, hold on. Okay, here you go. That's too much time. More than 2 seconds, you've lost that connection. It has to be really immediate that they get that food reward after they've done what you've asked them to do. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're giving the rewards, you need to give them at the dog's nose level. This is where the benefit of having large dogs and the downfall of having really small dogs. Because if you're doing it more up here and the dog's having to go up to grab it, you're now teaching them to jump up, which most people don't want their dog jumping up. And so it's got to be small, it's got to be quick, and it's got to be at their level when you're rewarding them for something that they've done right. Now, a lot of people criticize using food reward, saying that it's just like bribing and you're becoming dependent upon the food. And this is where, for me, I start off rewarding with food more consistently in the beginning as they're starting to learn these new techniques. And then as they start to get the idea of it down, you gradually start to taper off of it. You don't completely eliminate it, though. I oftentimes use the analogy, it's like putting money into a vending machine versus putting money into a slot machine. You put $1 into a vending machine, you select what you want, you know it's coming, you grab it, it's no big deal. You put money into a slot machine and you get something out, oh, that's awesome. Okay, we're going to go for it again. Oh, I didn't get it this time. Well, maybe I'll try again. I didn't win this time either. Oh, this time I did get something. And that's how gambling addictions start. They found scientifically that your best chance of solidifying a behavior are going to be those intermittent rewards. And like I said, those gambling addictions. I tell people all the time, you're trying to give your dog a gambling addiction. Where they don't know when they're going to get that reward, but they know it's coming at some point, and so they keep moving for it. Okay, so the big skill that you really want to start working with your dog, and again, I start this initially off leash and then start to build up working on leash, is pay attention. Now with pay attention, it's different for a few different reasons than how a lot of other trainers may teach something similar to this. One of the big differences is that I'm not necessarily looking for them to make and hold eye contact the whole time. Pay attention for me is just that signal of, hey, pay attention because something's about to change. And then you start to build it up to not only, hey, pay attention, something's about to change, and you should follow me, and getting them into the habit of that. And again, in the beginning, they have to really focus on it, and they're trying to learn it, and they've got to remember it, and they're going to make mistakes, but as you practice it, it's going to eventually just become a habit for them, and almost muscle memory where they hear that signal, and they immediately just turn and start to go with you. Now, the other really big difference with pay attention with how I do it, I don't use a word. I don't say heel. I don't say leave it or watch me or anything like that. I use a sound. The reasoning for this is because when you use words, it's very easy to attach emotion to it. So for instance, when you're walking your dog that tends to get overreactive on leash when they see another dog, everything's fine, then someone comes around the corner up ahead with their dog. And that instinctive, as you're bracing for, oh crap, Toby's gonna go crazy. And you're bracing for it, and then it's like, no, Toby, heel, heel, heel. The dog is not gonna, well, first of all, the dog's gonna pick up on you tensing up and you sounding tense and uncomfortable, but they're not gonna look at it in terms of, oh yeah, you're worried about what I might do. All they're gonna see is, everything was fine until that dog showed up. And then you instinctively you automatically tensed up. And then your voice sounds really nervous and uncomfortable. And so in the dog's mind, all you're doing is teaching them, dogs are bad. We gotta keep them away from us because it makes you really uncomfortable and apparently they're just a bad thing. So this is why I use a sound. Something that you can just make on your own. You're not dependent upon having to have like a whistle or a clicker or anything that makes a sound for you because again, just like with the food, you don't want to become dependent upon it because you may not always have it with you. And so the most common sounds that my clients will make is going to be things like the, or things like that you can just easily do with your mouth at any given time. So the first step when you're dealing with pay attention is that you want to teach the dog what that pay attention signal means, that it's important. So we've actually got a couple helpers. So let's bring one of them up here. Okay, so this is Cassie. She's one of the dogs that came from Utah Friends of Basset Hounds. And so with this, and thank you, Carol and Peggy, for volunteering them. But so what you'll do initially, Cassie, is you're just standing in front of them, and all you're going to initially do is make the sound, and then the food goes immediately down to them. So, Cassie. All you're trying to do is make that connection that when I hear this, something good tends to happen. So maybe I should be watching and paying attention when I hear it. So as you're practicing this with them, I would say on average, with most dogs, it usually takes them 3-5 times for them to start to make that initial connection. I've had a few take a little bit longer. Usually younger dogs or puppies that have a really hard time focusing, but I would say majority of them, 3 to 5 times is all that it really takes for them to make that connection that, okay, wait, what was that? As soon as they hear that sound.
I like this guy.
Yeah, so with her, as soon as I do it, okay, wait, where are we going? And so, and again, that reward has to go low, and it's got to be really quick. So I usually have, in one hand, I usually have majority of the treats, and the other, I have the other one ready and waiting. When she's making that initial connection that, okay, something's happening, I want to pay attention when I hear the sound, then you can start to take it a step further, where your next step for them is going to be that you're going to signal and then turn and just take 1 or 2 steps is all. Because now they're starting to follow you. So, and then you repeat this. And I don't really care if they take the long scenic route to get around to you. Sometimes it takes them a second because they sit there and start to think about, like, okay, wait, what's going on here? But the big thing is that you signal, turn, and move. Because now it's teaching them that, okay, I hear the sound and I want to pay attention. Oh, okay, where are we going? And they start to learn to follow you. And as you go, you gradually start to increase how far you're walking with them. The third step for teaching this is that you're going to signal, then move, signal, change direction, and then reward. So really with step 2, you're practicing this for a little bit of time. To really, as you gradually increase how far you're walking before they get that food reward, this is where we start to fade back the food reward a little bit, just so it's not making you completely dependent upon always having to have that food on you. So, good girl. So when you're ready to, and when the dog is ready to start changing directions and spreading out the rewards, what you'll do is and you'll notice too, like as we're practicing this more and more, she's starting to pay attention more and more, because there's a lot of distractions in here. There's a lot of smells, a lot of sounds, people, things like that. So. Now, your last step as you're perfecting this is that you want to start to make it harder. You start to, when they're doing well with where you signal, turn and move, signal, turn and move, and then reward, then you start building up to 3 times that you're signaling, moving, signaling, moving, signaling, moving, reward. When you can consistently be walking with every 3 times, then I completely make the rewards very sporadic. The first time might be on the 3rd signal and move, you get the food, and then the next time you get it after just 1. And then you go back to 3, and then 2, and then maybe 4, and where you make it very unpredictable, where I have no idea when I'm getting this. I just know that I'm getting it at some point. So, good girl.
Shane, we have a question online. If you're in a relationship or multiple people are training a dog, should they all be making this same noise?
Ideally, yes, because otherwise it can potentially get really confusing in terms of hearing all these different sounds and, okay, do they all really mean the same thing? Or it's just easier to pick one noise that everyone can do easily and stick with that. So you make it harder. You start to vary the rewards more and more. I will start doing a game with the dog that I call Crazy Eights, where you signal and you're moving and you signal again and then you signal over here, and so again it's making the dog, wait, where are you going? And so they start paying more and more attention to where you're going, as opposed to, oh no, I'm going this way, you should be the one following me. Now, some common mistakes that I have found that people really tend to struggle with catching up. Make sure that you signal first before you start to move. That's the dog's warning of, okay, something's happening, as opposed to just catching them off guard. So, good girl. Okay, so we'll just stick with Cassie for right now, just because we're getting short on time. Come on, Cassie. Thank you. Does anyone have questions with pay attention? Yes.
A dog that's a little bit hard of hearing and maybe progressing to not hearing.
Going deaf?
I can't whistle.
Right.
I don't know if a clicker would be, is there some sort of that sonar kind of sound that can hear?
So,
Instrument that I could use?
so her question is, what about dogs that are having a hard time with hearing or going deaf or are already deaf? What I would do at that point is use the hand signal, maybe patting your side, doing something more visual that can get their attention. Obviously this gets a little bit trickier because you have to be more within their view. But as we'll talk about, so you're initially practicing the pay attention off leash in the house, like I was saying. Then you start to practice off leash in the backyard. And then you start to practice on leash in the house. And with situations like that, it's a little bit easier too when they're on leash, because it's harder for them just to start to wander. And that's also why you start initially off leash inside the house, because there's less distractions and it's a little bit more of that controlled environment. But in terms of like dogs that are hard of hearing, I would use more of a signal or something more of like a visual cue that you can start to incorporate. And if they're not deaf but they're going deaf, then start to tie it where if you've already taught them a sound, then make the sound at the same time that you're doing the visual thing, so it just transfers over. Now, when you're practicing on leash in the house, again, controlled environment, fewer distractions, but now they don't have that flight option available to them anymore. And so at this point, what you're doing is you're introducing a new rule where there should be no tension in the leash. So when you're walking around and doing that game of the Crazy Eights, of the random change of direction, if at any point they start to get to the end of the leash and there's that tension in it, I stop walking and I wait. Because you want to teach the dog that, well, there's no point to you pulling. It doesn't benefit you. Every time you start to pull, we don't go anywhere. And I usually give them a few seconds, maybe up to 5 seconds, to see if they'll loosen up the tension. If they loosen up the tension, then I'll signal, or if they turn and look back, I'll signal and start to head in a different direction. If after about 5 seconds they don't do that on their own, then I'll still give that pay attention signal. And as soon as they look back at you, you turn and start to walk in a different direction. Because they're going to automatically, oh, okay, wait, we're going over this way. And it just starts to build them into that habit of following and watching you, and gets them out of the habit of pulling, because, well, pulling no longer serves a function. It doesn't work for anything anymore. Now, when you build up to the point where you're working on leash in the house, on leash in the backyard, then you start practicing on leash in the front yard. going across the street and back, down a few houses and back, down to the corner and back. You gradually start to build up how far you can move away from the home, but you initially keep it close to the home just so that you have that really easy escape route should you need it, in terms of, okay, the dog's just not listening, they're not paying attention, we're done. We're going back inside, leash is off, we'll try again later, or we'll do it again tomorrow. But eventually you're gonna get far enough away that you can just easily turn around and go back inside once you come across something. And so this is where you're gonna use that calming signal I mentioned earlier called curving. When you come across, whether it's another dog or a kid or someone walking, your goal is to signal to pay attention before the dog has a chance to really react or start to become fixated on what's approaching them. And what you'll do is you'll signal to pay attention and then you curve around it. Sometimes in the beginning, you have to make that curve where it's all the way across the street, maybe even to someone's yard a little bit. What I generally teach people is that if the dog is reacting, you need to curve more to give more space. Because what starts to happen is that the dog gets far enough away that it can calmly walk past without reacting back to whatever that stimulus is. And then that starts to become normal. And then you can gradually start to make that curve smaller and smaller to the point where it really just turns into more of a symbolic gesture of being polite, where you're walking and you just take a couple steps to the side just to give them some space. We're gonna have some space for ourselves. And for the dog, that's more of a polite interaction as opposed to this straight head-on interaction. So with this video that I'm gonna show, this is an example of curving. The first half of the video is going to be where you'll see that they start to curve, they start to signal to pay attention, but they do it a little bit too late, and they don't curve far enough. And so you'll see the reaction with the dog. You can already see that he's really fixated more on the guy that they're passing, and you get that sort of reaction. Now this next time, he signals 2 seconds sooner, and goes just a few more feet farther. Totally different reaction. Sometimes it's just a couple seconds and a few extra feet is all it really takes to be able to make that huge difference in terms of how the dog is reacting. And each dog is going to be different. Each dog is going to be different in terms of how much they're going to react, how much space that they need, what they react to. But I've had some people where, okay, they don't have enough space just even going across the street, and so we're going to start practicing at a park, where if you need to curve 50 feet, you curve 50 feet, or 100 feet, or however much space you need, to start to develop a new habit of, okay, well, we just walk by these things. And okay, well, that's not a big deal, nothing's happened, and then that just becomes normal, and that becomes a habit, and so then the dogs, when you're dealing with really any big behavior issue, solutions for dealing with it is a 2-step process. You take away the ability for them to react the way that they normally have been in that situation. You take away that opportunity. And then when enough time passes, they start to get out of the habit of it. Then you start to teach a different reaction. So in the case of this, rather than immediately walking right past these other dogs, and then it turns into this whole big thing, you start to curve around. And you give enough space where, okay, well, this is now the new normal. And then as a dog, that becomes more habitual for them. You can make that curve smaller and smaller. Okay, now some common things to keep in mind to set yourselves up for success and set your dogs up to success is that you got to look at their attention span. Typically with adult dogs, when they're learning something new, their attention span is about 10-15 minutes. You don't want to go much further than that. If at any point when you're working with your dog, you're starting to see them suddenly losing focus, having a hard time concentrating, making mistakes, cut it short. It's better to end on a high note where the last thing that they're going to remember is them doing it correctly. Now, keeping in mind too that puppies and young dogs, that attention span is even shorter than that. Sometimes it's like the blink of an eye and you're done. You have to work within the realms of what your dog can handle in terms of being able to focus. As you start to practice this more and more, you can gradually start to lengthen how much time you can spend doing it, because it starts to become less of a new thing that they have to really focus on or try to concentrate on, and then it just becomes more about, okay, yeah, I know what we're doing. And it's just like with any person. If you're learning, for instance, a new instrument, how hard is it in the beginning? but you practice it enough, and then it's just automatic where it's not really that mentally taxing on you. So you can start doing it for longer and longer. Now, the thing to keep in mind, though, is that when you start to introduce new things or you start to make it a little bit harder and more challenging to build up and make that basic skill more advanced, you might be shortening up that attention span again. You might have to keep it where it's back to just 10 minutes 2 times a day that you're practicing these things. It's better to do 2 or 3 small training sessions than one big long one.
Shane, sorry. We have a few questions online if you have a second.
Sure.
So we have a question, if you have multiple pups that you would like to walk at once, or should you be practicing with one dog at a time when you're working on walking on leash?
I would practice with one dog at a time because, again, each dog is going to be different. You may have one dog that picks up on this really quickly and you're walking on leash in the backyard while you've got another one that is struggling with still just basic pay attention off leash in the house. You know, you got to work with each one individually, and then when they're doing well with that individually, then I start to pair them up. And if you have multiple dogs, I'll do where it's, you know, dogs A and B, and then, you know, this next time it's A and C, D and B, you know, where you're switching up the pairs, and then you can start building up to 3 dogs and 4 dogs as you're building up how many you can walk at a time.
And one follow-up question. So we have a few of our listeners online who do not have backyards or front yards, so they have to walk their pets outside, so people who are living in an apartment community and things like that. So their questions are, should they be doing as much training inside on and off leash to help with these distractions, or do you have any other suggestions for those situations?
Ideally, yes. You want to try to do as much as you can on leash, off leash initially in the house. If you are in a situation like an apartment complex where you have to just at least walk them outside to go to the bathroom on leash, you still want to try to be as consistent as you can. So make sure that you prepare and you give yourselves extra time if it takes longer, because every time they start pulling, you stop walking and then you turn and go a different direction when they, you know, loosen up that tension. The other thing to keep in mind too, though, is that look at your other options for exercise. You know, again, look to see which one of your friends or family has a backyard that will let you use it, you know, from time to time to throw the ball around for your dog, or going to a park that's fenced that you can play with the dogs, or letting them go to daycare once or twice a week to help get some of that excess energy out, just to try to offset that. Also look at mental stimulation. You can oftentimes substitute some of that physical exercise with mental stimulation, because that's just going to be just as tiring for a lot of dogs as the physical stuff is. So is there any other questions?
I think that's it for now. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So the other thing to look at for setting yourself up to success is you need to relax. A lot of people, when they first pick up the leash, they have it wrapped up really tight like this, and now you're trying to just do everything with your arms. So the dog starts to pull and the knee-jerk reaction is to yank back. Relax yourself. Use your whole body, so that way if they start to pull, you can use your whole body to brace yourself and to stop before they loosen that up, and now we're going to go this direction. The other thing to keep in mind too, like I mentioned earlier, when you come across things out on the walk, this is really hard for a lot of people and something you have to really be honest with yourself and really retrain yourself on doing. But don't do that knee-jerk tensing up and pulling the dog tighter the second that you see something. You know, again, before they have a chance to really react or fixate, signal to pay attention, and now we're going to curve around and give some space. So now they're focusing more on you as opposed to, okay, now we're coming across something that we have to directly pass. Other things to keep in mind, you're, again, looking for no tension on the leash. You're looking for that loose leash, because why do dogs pull? Well, it's because we follow them. You know, we let them pull and we still just keep going on. As soon as they start to put tension on that leash, stop walking and either wait a few seconds to see if they'll loosen that up themselves and then turn and go a different direction, or if they're not, signal for them to pay attention. The second that they look back, then you turn and move. So that way it's teaching them that, well, there's no point to me pulling, because as soon as that leash tightens up, we stop moving anywhere. So what's the point of me doing this? It's not going to benefit me. And then the other thing too is that you want to enjoy the walk. A lot of people just turn the walk into almost like a military march, where they have to be right there at your side and, where they can't stop to sniff anything, they can't, stop to look at something, okay, wait, what's that? It's that very constant brisk, we're moving. And yeah, there's gonna be times where, no, we gotta keep moving because we're on a bit of a time crunch, or, okay, well, there's someone dropped some food that, again, rather than saying leave it, just signal for them to pay attention and you move around it. And that's gonna be where that pay attention signal comes into play, where if they do start to get distracted or wanna stop for something that you gotta keep moving, you just signal for them to pay attention and you keep going. But with that being said, if your walk consists of 30 minutes just to get down the block because they wanna explore and sniff things, is that really such a bad idea? We're constantly being told, no, you shouldn't let them do that because then they're in control of the walk. No, they're just exploring things. And again, that's mental stimulation for them to sniff, okay, well, what's this? Well, who's peed on this tree? Oh, there's a few dogs that have peed on this tree. Or they smell the grasshopper that is crawling through the grass. It's completely fine for them occasionally just to have where that walk is more just them exploring, where they're able to have that curiosity develop and build. Because a healthy curiosity for a dog is going to help protect and vaccinate them against insecurities and fears, because they feel like, well, I can handle new things. I'm able to explore new things instead of I get in trouble every time I want to go explore something new. And again, like I was saying before, there's a time and a place where, no, we got to keep moving, and that's when you just signal for them to pay attention and we're going to keep moving on. But it doesn't always have to be that way. And guaranteed, them sniffing things for half an hour is probably going to wear them out just as much, if not more, as if you were just going 30 minutes around the block. So now with the walks, there's a lot that really goes into it, and there's always going to be different variables and different things that can come up that you have to adjust and you have to be flexible with. But honestly, what I have found to be the most useful skill to teach your dog is going to be that pay attention. And to not, if you can avoid it, not just immediately try practicing in very high distraction environments, because that's like trying to teach someone how to swim by just chucking them in the deep end and saying, well, sorry, you just have to deal with it. Start with those basics, start in the safety of the shallows, build up. And if at any point as you're teaching this that the dog starts really struggling or you start to feel like you aren't as happy and in control of the situations, pull it back to where you did feel it. Practice a little bit more there to really solidify it more there before you start building on it and continuing forward with that. So does anyone have questions? Yes?
Trying to think how to phrase this. What is your opinion on how important it is the dog direction of a leash? Because I was talking to someone today about how as soon as they see it, they get excited, and that kind of sets the mood wrong.
Yes.
And then based on your opinion with that, what's a good way to lower or change their reactivity to the leash where it's just they don't get excited?
Okay.
Can you just repeat that for the listeners online?
Yeah, so
Thanks,
the question was basically, what about triggers that set the dog off? Most common one is going to be when you pick up the leash, they immediately go through the roof because, oh my gosh, we're going for a walk. But it could be hearing the word walk, it could be seeing you putting on running shoes, grabbing your jackets, different things that they've associated with, this means we're going out. And what I always teach my clients as one of the first things that you do off leash in the house is you want to desensitize to those triggers. Because dogs are a lot like people where there's emotions and then there's thinking, the logical side of things. And very rarely do they blend really well together. It's like with a person, if you get into a really big fight with someone, it's not until usually a couple hours later that you start to think, oh my gosh, I should have said this. When they said this, I could have responded with that. Or you start thinking of all the things that, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. But when you're in that heat of the moment, you're just reacting and you can't think clearly. Dogs are the exact same way. And so when you have the dog going crazy as soon as you pick up the leash, and then on top of that, people that are going, you want to go for a walk? Okay, come on, let's go. And winding them up further, you've lost control before you ever step foot out of the house. because their excitement and their energy and their emotions are now here when really you want it, it's normally get excited, but they still need to be able to be in control and to be able to be focused and whatnot. It's getting them all wound up and then expecting them to suddenly be able to walk really well and no heel and things like that on the leash when you walk outside is like taking a little kid to Disneyland and taking them on all these rides and they get all the cotton candy and all the treats and whatnot. And then halfway through the day, okay, well now we have to do homework. And we're gonna sit here in the middle of everything going on and you're gonna do homework. It's not gonna happen. They can't focus, because they're so wound up and they're so excited. So the way to do that is you wanna break those associations with those triggers. If it's you picking up the leash, pick up the leash, put it on the coffee table. And then when the dogs settle down, you pick up the leash again, you put it on the kitchen table, then on the counter, then on the back of the couch, and you randomly move it from place to place because that's gonna start to break the association that this automatically means this. I've had some people go and say, well, we can't even spell the W word anymore because they've learned how to spell it. And so when I'm like, so wait, you guys can't say the word walk? And immediately the dog starts going crazy, like, because, you're not just gonna be going for a walk every time you say walk, are you? You might say walk a lot of different times. It's not necessarily gonna mean that you're going for a walk if you say walk. And as we're going through it, the dog finally gets to a point where when I would say walk, it's, all right, I get it, we're not going. So you do wanna try to at least diffuse as many of those triggers as possible because like I was saying, you start up here and it's just gonna keep climbing from there and it gets so much harder. You've lost control before you ever step foot out of the house. So, any other questions? Yes?
When is it good to teach your dog, to heel next to you when you're on a walk, or just let them wander with the leash in front of you?
So, the question is, when is it good to have them learning heel right next to you on the walk versus kind of out in front of you? And again, this is where I vary from some other trainers. I don't necessarily care if they're right there at your side. I don't mind if there's a little bit of that movement behind or in front, as long as there's a loose leash and they're paying attention and they're walking with you instead of walking you. Kind of going back to what I was saying before, the walk should be that enjoyable experience. You should be able to let them, where they sniff things here and there and stuff like that, and that should be fine. Now, obviously, if the dog is, oh, now we're going over here, that's not okay, because that's not respectful, and that's the dog dragging you from place to place to do what they want. But I don't mind if it's more of that relaxed, where they're a little bit ahead or behind or to the side, as long as they're being respectful, there's a loose leash, and they're at least checking in and glancing back. If you start to notice that they're getting a little bit ahead and they're not really glancing back or taking notice of what you're doing, again, that's where I'll just signal and start to go a different direction. So it's that reminder of, oh, okay, that's right, I'm following you. So, any other questions?
Oh, I'm coming. I'm on the job now.
So if we're walking down a street and there's not very much space to do a curve, would you recommend turning and going the direction so it's you can kind of divert to a different street, or would you make them maybe sit and just kind of turn their back to what's
a lot of it
the
really depends upon
trigger?
where the dog is at in their progress. If they're still pretty easily reactive when they come across things from more of a distance, I would try to avoid those streets where you don't have that. So busy streets where you can just easily go around. And like I was saying before, if you need to, start practicing where, okay, we're gonna get in the car, we're gonna go to a park, and we're gonna start at a park where if we need to curve, we can go make a big, huge sweeping curve if needed. Really try to be mindful of these things as you're beginning to work on these issues, to try to set yourself and the dog up for success. Try to avoid as much as possible getting in those situations where you're going to be trapped. You can just turn and start to go back the other direction and maybe avoid and divert that way. Some dogs you can go and just curve as much as possible and then just kind of stop and wait for whatever it is to pass, because again, okay, well, we can't avoid, so our next option is to freeze. And what I usually will do at that point though is another calming signal that dogs do called splitting, where I have myself in between, maybe using a hand signal, just kind of helping block the dog from whatever it is that's passing. But as much as possible, try to avoid letting yourself get in those tight situations where you are going to get stuck.
My neighborhood is small, narrow streets, no sidewalks, so it's not.
Yeah.
So trying to do the training on is.
Sure. Yeah, and that might be where it might be useful to go in the car and just go a few blocks to somewhere that's a bit more open if you need to in the beginning. Try to be flexible with this. A lot of people tend to, well, we just can't do that. There's ways around it. You just have to be flexible about it and look at your options. So, any other questions? Yes.
So,
an online one too.
Okay.
my question is, my dogs know when we go to the dog park as soon as we arrive.
Okay.
So I don't like to put them on the leash right away because then they'll just drag me to the gate.
Okay.
So would you just leave them in the car until they're settled down?
Yeah, you
Or-
could maybe initially park a little bit further away if possible too, to give them a chance to stay a little bit calmer and then practice that pay attention and the crazy eights in the parking lot as you gradually get closer. Maybe even practicing where you just go there a few times, not even with the intention of going to the dog park. The whole idea is just trying to desensitize them to that excitement of going inside the park. Okay, and then what was the...
We have a listener online, so they have a super social butterfly dog that
Okay.
when they go on walks and the dog sees other dogs, the dog gets really excited and tries to do zoomies and things around the other dog. And it's the balancing act of, you know, what should they be doing to kind of reel that dog back in? They want the dog to make friends and play, but the dog's getting really excited.
And really, I handle the really social, overly excited dogs the exact same way as the ones that are getting really defensive and overreactive. You know, your goal is ideally, especially with trying to socialize your dog, I tend to have a different opinion and a different view of what socializing your dog should look like than a lot of other people do. I look at it where you know your goal is not to get them where, oh my gosh, there's something, you know, and they get over the top excited. I want them just comfortable and familiar enough that it's just kind of more like a, well, okay, yeah, who cares? It's just another dog or it's just another person. The same way that we as people, if we're walking through a store, typically you walk right past the majority of the people and you forget everything about them within 5 seconds. Because it's just, you can't pay attention to every little tiny detail of every person you pass because that's just going to overload you. So even with that, I still will curve around initially. And yeah, there's going to be times where, okay, you know, yeah, we want to engage and play and whatnot, but it's still teaching them to still keep themselves polite and make sure that that interaction is more mutual, because you never know if the other dog really does want to interact back too. You know, you have to be mindful where it's not even just you giving yourself space to let your dog stay calm, but it's also trying to take off pressure from the other dog. And you get to the point where you don't even really need to do much of a curve. It just more is that where you just take a couple steps aside to be able to walk by. And then if you want to stop and let the dog sniff or interact, things like that, that's fine. But trying to avoid the really over-the-top going crazy, especially where they're both on leash and they're both going to get tangled up. And it just makes it a bit harder. So in the beginning, I handle it the same way, where you're trying to get them a little bit calmer so they're more in control instead of, because what can oftentimes happen is it starts off as, oh my gosh, I'm really excited, I want to get over there, and then the other dog starts reacting back from a distance, and then because your dog can't get there, that excitement starts to turn to frustration, which then can erupt into more of a aggressive looking reaction. It's all about trying to diffuse those things a little bit more.
And kind of a follow-up to that, so for our herding folks that have our dogs that get down into that crouch position as they're coming up to other dogs, any advice or tips or tricks on those types of dogs?
This is where you really want to pay attention and make sure that you signal before they have a chance to really start to fixate. Because especially with border collies in particular, how they herd is using their posturing and their eye contact and staring other things down. And kind of going back to the video of the curving, that first half, the first example, you saw the dog where it got just close enough that it just really started fixating more and more on the person that they were passing, as opposed to the second one where we signaled it was 2 seconds is all the difference was. And that was enough to be able to keep him more focused on the owner and the fact that they went about 3 more feet away, that you're looking at the realm and the threshold of what that dog can handle. And trying to catch it before they have a chance to really start to fixate and posture and get all tense. So, and I've seen this curving and the pay attention work with dogs that, like the herding dogs that want to chase after cars or things like that. But again, you need to set yourself up to succeed, where initially you're practicing this where you're maybe at a park that goes along a roadway. So that way as a car approaches, you make a big curve around, and then you can gradually start making it smaller and smaller, so it gets them out of the habit of, there's a car, I want to go for it. and more in the habit of, okay, we're just going to kind of move away and around it. And then that gets less and less. So it gets them out of the habit of wanting to chase and more in the habit of wanting to follow you. Some of those definitely can take longer because you're working against some of their natural instincts, depending on the breed, but it can work for them too. So, okay, any other questions?
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Shane, so
Yeah.
much. That was so wonderful. Everyone took a nice hand. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight at our You Care series. Next month is going to be another really fun month. We have our grooming team from the Animal Care Center that's going to be going over some at-home grooming tips and tricks for all sorts of different dogs. So we'll be here the first Tuesday in May, and then again we'll have our yappy hour with food and snacks and things for 30 minutes, and then the presentation will be from 7 to 8. And then a little teaser for June, we're going to be talking about pet volunteers within our communities. So it's going to be a fun next few months. We hope to see you next month. Thank you again, Shane.